Hey fellas, before we get into today's episode, I want to give you a heads up that on November 11th, the Man Amongst Men podcast will be undergoing a name change. The new name of the podcast is the Great Man Podcast. If you are already subscribed, there's nothing that you need to do. You will automatically be updated. If you have not yet subscribed, then I would encourage you to go subscribe to the podcast now so that we will automatically show up in your feed. You won't be confused. I go through the entire rationale as to why we are renaming the podcast to The Great Man Podcast in episode number 44, entitled Discovering the Great Man Within You. So you can go back to episode number 44, Discovering the Great Man Within You. The show will be renamed on November 11th, The Great Man Podcast. And like I said, nothing you need to do if you're already subscribed. And if you're not, subscribe now. That way you don't miss any of the amazing new episodes that are coming. Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Bryan. Welcome to the Man Amongst Men podcast.
Ultralearning is the title of the Wall Street Journal best-selling book written by Scott Young, today's guest on our show. Now, ultralearning is a term that Scott himself coined, which he defines as the intense and self-directed strategy to acquire skills of your desire. Now, ultralearning can be used to acquire skills in many different arenas, like learning to speak Mandarin, mastering the bass guitar, or in Scott's case, self-studying MIT's 4-year computer science program. Yes, all 33 courses he self-studied on his own in a mere 12 months. This is a feat that catapulted Scott to the forefront of the modernization of how we learn movement. In other words, one of the key pillars of ultralearning is mastering the skill of how to learn with speed, depth, proficiency, and retention. As you'll hear in our conversation, one of Scott's stories features a computer science programmer who took on the ultralearning challenge of public speaking. And within 7 months, that same man who had very little public speaking experience found himself on stage at the Toastmasters World Championship Finals. He didn't get there by accident. He employed Scott's 9 principles of ultralearning, some of which we'll go over today, to launch him there. Now, think about how many books you read, training courses you attend, or podcasts you consume, even like this one, that you forget all about just a few days or weeks later. But what if your learning efforts could produce far more dramatic, meaningful, and lasting results? As James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, the #1 New York Times bestseller, says in the foreword of Scott's book, passive learning creates knowledge, but active practice creates skill. We have enough guys walking around with big brains and big ideas, but not big enough balls to step into the arena, get their shit kicked in a little, but actually acquire some meaningful skills along the way. Reading books and listening to podcasts are a great start, but that's what James Clear calls passive learning. And we are here to guide you to take inspired action with your life. So, in our conversation with Scott, we asked him to hone in his principles of ultralearning to 2 of the most important areas of focus that you, our audience, have defined. Number 1, how to find your purpose. When you know that there's more out there for you, but you may not know what that is, how do you find your purpose? Scott's going to weigh in on that. And number 2, how to become an ultralearner in lifestyle design. Mastering the art of designing your life in a way that inspires you the most. One of our favorite quotes from the interview is when Scott says, "You don't really know what your purpose is going to be until you pursue something seriously." Over these next 50 minutes or so, we hope you'll find some inspiration to take on an ultralearning project, pursue it seriously, and level up your life. Mr. Scott Young, welcome to the Man Amongst Men podcast, my friend.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Yeah, Bryan and I were talking about how we are friends of Connor Beaton. We love his show, Man Talks, the podcast, and we had a chance to listen to you on that show. You said it was your first of maybe 100 podcasts that you've done now?
Yeah, that was really early on that I did that recording. He was one of the earliest ones that I recorded with, yeah.
So you're going to be like 100 times better on this conversation?
Yeah. I'm so polished. That's what's happened. So no, I think it's been good to have a lot of conversations with different groups of people about the book and just kind of get that feeling. I was kind of joking to, I think it was my literary agent, that you get all these conversations about the book after you've written it, it would have been really nice to have had all these conversations before you wrote it. You're like, oh, this is what people think. And then you can make some adjustments. Now, I feel pretty good about how I wrote the book, but it's kind of funny that you get all these, interesting conversations once it's already on the written page and you have to wait for a second or third.
I'm sure that you have book 2 at least rolling around in your head. So if you'd like to use this podcast to really test some of those here, bring it up.
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
So Scott, the book is called Ultralearning, Accelerate Your Career, Master Hard Skills, and Outsmart the Competition. I've had a chance to read it cover to cover. I love it. I told you I have 14, 15 pages of notes that we're going to go through. And I always like to see who's endorsed the work. Right on the cover of your book is Cal Newport, right, author of Digital Minimalism and Deep Work. And then James Clear, author of Atomic Habits, is a friend of yours who wrote the foreword. So you've got quite an arsenal of people who are backing your work. So maybe we can just dive in here.
Sure.
And tell us, what is ultralearning? What does that mean and how have you defined it?
So ultralearning is the combination of self-directed learning and what I call aggressive learning. So we're talking about definitions here to start, but basically I went around and I found these people who just accomplished these incredible things where they have learned really hard skills in shortened time frames or using kind of unconventional methods or, without having going to school or without having to pay a lot of money or really using the normal formal education process. And so I kind of defined ultralearning this way because I think these two ingredients are incredibly important. The self-directed nature of ultralearning, I think, is very important because, to be quite frank, I don't think universities, colleges, higher education are cutting it. For a lot of us, it is incredibly expensive to go back to school. It requires a lot of time. It's incredibly inflexible. And as you'll see, as I talk about in some of the chapters of my book, a lot of what you learn in school is not particularly useful. It's not aimed at what is going to make actual direct benefit in your life, what is actually going to allow you to be good at things in your career, good at skills that really matter. And so often you're spending a lot of time and money just to get a piece of paper, just to get a credential that says that you went to school, and then you go to work and the job. And then that's when you actually have to learn how to do everything. And that, I think, is really unfortunate. And the second thing that I think is important is because the world is becoming more complicated, it's becoming more difficult, we're requiring more technology, more computers, jobs are getting outsourced, automation is taking away some of the simpler jobs. It's also the case that we live in a world where you need to be learning things. You need to have hard skills. You need to have broad knowledge, deep knowledge to really succeed in your professional and personal life. And so at the same time that education's kind of dropping the ball, we're also seeing this incredible need for these kinds of skills. And so I think the ability to take on your own projects to say, you know what, hey, I want to become a programmer. Let's become a programmer. I want to become an excellent public speaker or a writer, or I want to be able to move from where I am right now up into, a management position without having to spend $200,000 on an MBA. I think these are super powerful skills. The aggressive part of it, which is kind of where the word ultra, where that's coming from, is because if you look into the cognitive science of learning, if you look into how the brain actually learns things, it's not that there's just one particular finding, but there's this constellation of different findings that all point in the same direction. And that direction is that the default or status quo approach to learning things is not as effective as something that requires a little bit more effort. So we can go into some of those principles. And I know you've read the books, so you've had some sense of some of those different ideas, but I think this is a kind of a repeated finding. And so what happens, and this is often how we approach learning things, is we don't know what really works. We don't have any real sense of, oh no, but if you want to do this, you have to do it this way. And because of this, we kind of just go with whatever's most convenient or often easiest. And then we kind of get frustrated that after, 6, 12 months, we haven't made as much progress as we would like. And so I think that the ultra aspect of ultra learning is both the kind of hope and also the difficulty, and that you have to be deliberate and it's effortful and sometimes a bit more frustrating and a little bit more strenuous. But at the same time, if you're really willing to dive deep on this, then you can actually do a lot better than maybe you naively would have thought based on your past experiences or from looking around at other people. And so throughout the book, I document people who've gotten really good at languages, public speaking, programming, starting businesses, all sorts of different pursuits that involve learning hard skills. And they've done it quite dramatically so, I think, because of these reasons.
Yeah, you've got some great stories in the book. It's incredibly well researched. But I think it'd be really cool if you could share a couple of your aggressive learning strategies that you've become famous for and also that you wrote about in the book that maybe a few other people haven't had a chance to learn about yet.
Yeah. So again, a big reason for me writing this book was also that this has been kind of my life for the last 10 years. That about 10 years ago, I was a student in university and I was studying and I got kind of interested in how to study more efficiently, more effectively, so I could have more time to do other things. But after I left, I started to encounter these people that I call ultralearners, people who are not learning things to get a grade at school or to pass an exam, but so that they can acquire a meaningful skill in a more effective way. And so my first real introduction to that was Benny Lewis, who speaks about 10 plus languages. But this really encouraged me also to start doing some of my own projects. So some of the projects I've done is I did one project I called the MIT Challenge, where using MIT's free online resources, I tried to learn their 4-year computer science curriculum by passing the final exams and doing the programming projects over 12 months. So I did my first class in October of 2011, and I passed the final class in September of 2012. I did another project with a friend. We called it the Year Without English. So we went to 4 countries, Spain, Brazil, China, and South Korea, to learn Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, Chinese, and Korean. And the idea, or sort of the conceit of the project, was that when we would land in each country, we would only speak in the language we were trying to learn with each other and with anyone we would meet. And the outcome of that meant that we were doing a lot of practice, but also that we got good at speaking those languages a lot faster than I think is typical. So in Spain, for instance, had lots of friends, were going to parties. I was even seeing a Spanish girl at the time. And this was all happening in Spanish within this 3-month period, which I don't know about your experiences with learning languages, but at least for me, prior to that, I mean, most of the time you would spend a couple years maybe practicing a language before you're attempting to do something like that. And so I've done a couple of these projects, but really the book isn't about my projects. I think the book is about just trying to show these examples so that people can see what is possible if you really take it seriously.
Yeah, Scott, I noticed you mentioned you were dating a Spanish woman at that time.
Yeah, there was a girl that I was seeing that I met when I was in Spain, and we were speaking in Spanish to each other. I don't want to say that like it's always perfectly smooth communication, but just that that's possible after, about a month and a half, I think is something that most people don't think about when they're considering learning a language.
Well, it sounds like you had quite the inspiration to learn Spanish faster and better. So part of Ultralearning, I know, is being in the right learning environment. And I'd say a beautiful Spanish woman definitely provides that context.
It probably helps for sure. But I would say that like in China, for instance, I was really interested in learning Mandarin Chinese. I wasn't dating anyone at that time, and I did really focus on it as well. So the inspiration was intrinsic, but yeah, it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of encouragement.
Scott, I love how you kind of just casually glazed over the fact that you completed MIT's computer science program in the course of a year. I know you took 33 classes, sometimes studied up to 60 hours per week. And this is pretty well documented online with some of your TEDx talks and some other podcasts. And in the book as well. So I don't know if we need to go too deep into there. I want to encourage people to buy your book to hear about that story. But a fun fact I did learn about you is that in your undergrad, it took you 5 years to complete your undergrad finance business degree. And it only took you 1 year to do MIT's.
To be fair, I will say this, because when I tell people 5 years, it sounds like I was like a bad student or something. In my particular program, it was a little bit more than 4 years. So if you do a full-time course load, which again, most students don't do, but if you do a full-time course load, which is 5 per semester, it normally takes 4 and 1 semester. But I went on exchange. That was something I did earlier. This was how I was introduced to Benny Lewis, and they wouldn't let me do a full course load when I was there. So I ended up doing about 5 years. But I think what you're saying, though, I think is absolutely right, that it wasn't about my intelligence that doing it in that process. It was just bureaucratic rules that prevented me from doing it at a different pace. And I wasn't trying to go through my university program as quickly as I could. But at the same time, I think that for a lot of us, we have this idea that, to learn what they teach in college takes exactly 4 years. And I wouldn't say that it's necessarily that everyone can learn it in, 6 months or something, but that 4 years is really arbitrary. For some people with the right, methods and motivation and mixing of things, you might be able to learn it faster, maybe 3 years, maybe 2 years. And then maybe for some people, even the 4-year degree is going to be a real struggle. And if they extended it out to 5 or 6 years, they'd have more time to master the material. So I think the idea that I want to promote on your podcast here is not so much that everything can be done lightning speed, but rather that we tend to accept these rather arbitrary milestones of how long it should take to learn something. And these usually just completely made up. They don't actually reflect like the underlying biological reality of what is involved in learning. And so you can go faster in some instances, but there's also instances where it makes sense to go slow and really learn something deeply. And so I cover people in the book who really did that they did something in a painstaking way, but as a result, they were able to get incredible results that just really exceed what you would have done from a shallower interpretation of going through those skills.
Scott, I really love checking in on a belief. And it's something Dominic and I talk a lot about on this podcast is what is the belief that is driving our behavior? And for me, I always thought 4 years, college education, like of course it takes 4 years. And it's something that I hadn't really inspected, and therefore my actions and behaviors were associated with that. So I love the opportunity here to pause and say, wait a second, is it really have to be 4 years? Like, what are the real requirements? So I love that. And I hadn't really applied that to learning, which is beautiful.
And you know what I'll say as well, because I think, again, if the MIT challenge, that entire idea of that project was based on this idea, has anyone ever tried to kind of simulate a college education without going to college? And so that itself is a little bit of a conceit most people probably don't need, because for most people, if you're not actually going to get the degree, then there's also the additional question of why try to meticulously copy what you would learn in a degree. And so for a lot of people, if your goal is, let's say, I want to be a professional programmer, which is a reasonable goal to have after, completing a computer science degree, you could take it in a way that doesn't involve classes at all. So Trent Fowler, who is one of the people that I met in the course of learning this, did his own project to learn engineering and computer science, kind of similar to my year-long MIT challenge. But he didn't even try to approximate classes. He just did these 4 sort of, I think it was engineering, artificial intelligence. I'd have to look at them, but he had 4 different areas of math and technology that he wanted to master. And he just did projects to get really good at them. So he did projects to master, programming and stuff. And so in some ways, that's actually, I think, closer to the spirit of what I like to advocate in Ultralearning, is not even thinking of the constraints that I was doing at that time period. But I think it was still a very interesting project and I learned a lot from it. But I think at the same time, just even scrapping the whole idea of degrees altogether and just saying, I want to get really good at web programming. What's the direct path of doing that? You might be able to get to a point where you can program reasonably, good programs in maybe 6 to 9 months, even if you're not learning everything that was covered in a computer science degree.
Yeah, Scott. So you have lived the Ultralearning principles. Like, you put it into use with taking the MIT course and doing it in 1 year, and then taking a year and not speaking English and going into these different environments where you were thrown right into the water. And, for our audience who has now seen that and been inspired by that, and also is looking for a practical way for them to embody Ultralearning in their lives, one of the things that we talked about before this podcast was really around this conversation about finding purpose. Mm-hmm. And I believe, and having read your book, that, and then you even say this throughout the book as well, that Ultralearning can give you a sense of purpose and meaning. But people in our community are very interested in, how do I find my purpose, right? And because they know they're capable of doing more. Many of them are, say, in corporate jobs, or they're working 10 to 12 hours a day. So how can we take your Ultralearning principles, and I know there's 9 of them, in order to help someone who doesn't even know where to begin to start to find their purpose using the work that you've created?
So, you know what? I'm going to start by telling a story because I think it really embodies what you're talking about. And so this is a story of Tristan de Montebello, and he is rather unusual of the stories I document in the book because I actually knew him before he did his project. So a lot of the stories I'm encountering people, I hear about them in the news or something, and then I track them down and try to retroactively figure out what they did to accomplish their result. But in this case, this was a person that I actually knew for several years before I started working with him. And he knew I was going to be writing this book about ultralearning, and he had seen some of my project, and he was saying, I'd like to do some kind of project. Well, maybe you can watch me do the project, and then that can be something kind of interesting. Now, the interesting thing about this is that he had no idea what he wanted to do. So this is not coming from this place of, okay, you know what, this is the thing I want to do. It was sort of like, well, what could I do? I know that I want to do maybe some kind of intensive learning project. I'd like to try this, because he's just interested in the concept, but he wasn't really sold on any particular thing. And at the time, I think he was doing kind of odd jobs here and there. He was doing a little bit of consulting, a little bit of web development. I know he was running a course teaching guitar instruction because he was a guitarist. So because of all these sorts of things, he was saying, well, maybe I'll learn piano, because I already know guitar and piano. And this was purely from my perspective, because I was just thinking, well, you already know how to play guitar, though. So knowing how to play piano or learning piano really well, it just isn't as good a story, because, maybe you're really good at music, right? That's kind of the critique of that. And so I actually pushed him away from his first choice just because it wouldn't make as good material for my books. So that's like a completely selfish decision on my part. And so again, he goes off for like a couple of weeks, and then we have a call again later, and he says, okay, so I'm thinking maybe public speaking. And he liked the kind of idea that public speaking is pretty general. It applies to a lot of different careers. Being a good speaker helps for lots of things. And I said, yeah, that's cool. And we started talking about, okay, well, how would you do it in this kind of thing? And what would be your kind of your final exam? What would be the thing that, to say that you've gotten good at public speaking? We thought, well, maybe if he really worked at it, he could give like a TEDx talk somewhere that's really good. And, it would be a nice TEDx talk. And he could say, okay, I've gotten this TEDx talk. What actually happened with him is so crazy that it's actually one of the crazier stories in the book, which makes the fact that this just kind of happened so accidentally all the more surprising. That he went and worked hard. He did the kind of ultralearning approach to public speaking. And over 7 months, he went from having very little experience, basically picking this up on a whim, to being a finalist for the World Championship of Public Speaking. This is a competition put on by Toastmasters every year. There's about 32,000 people that compete. He made it into the top 10. And so this is elimination style, like basically competing against 10 people. You have to be the winner to go on to the next thing, to go on to the next thing, to go on to the next thing. There's several layers of this that he just kept winning, and he kept practicing. And so over this 7-month period of time, he reached that goal. And I don't actually think that that's the most remarkable thing about this story, that he is able to be in top 10 in the world after 7 months of practice. Rather, it was after he did this, him and the person that he met who was kind of coaching him along in this project decided that this was going to be their career. Their life was going to be helping people with public speaking. And they decided to start a consultancy, and they were working with people. And I just had a call with him a couple of days ago. He's working with like CEOs and executives and, big corporations, instructing them not even about public speaking, but also about how adjusting their public speaking can impact their personal lives. Because he said that, for him, it was learning that how someone acts on the stage is just how they act as a leader, how they act as a manager. And I could just tell from talking to him that this is the thing that burns him up inside that he wants to do. And so it's so funny to pull that dial back to meet someone who's so intensely passionate about what they're doing, and that they feel so fulfilled about what results they're getting in their life, and realize this was a whim. This was something that he could have been doing. He could have been teaching people chopsticks on the piano right now. He just did this by chance. And so I think the lesson to draw from this is that you don't know what your purpose is going to be until you really pursue something seriously. And so I think that it can come from anywhere. I don't really feel that we have these predestined purposes and passions, that everyone has one purpose on this earth. We just have to find it. Rather, I think purposes are things you construct and build. And so if you can start down that path of really taking something seriously and going to the next level, very often it can take you to places that you hadn't even imagined when you got started. And I think Tristan's example is certainly extreme, but I think it also illustrates this principle.
I love that story. That purpose isn't something we build, not something that we're born with, right? And what I like about ultralearning, ultimately, yes, it's aggressive, yes, it's personalized, but it gives us freedom. I can't tell you how many times in my life I'm like, oh, I'd probably be really good at that. But I don't know. I haven't done it. And the barriers to me doing it have been, well, am I too old to go do that? do I have the time to go do that? I got a lot on my plate right now. Do I have the time? And like, God, I don't want to be $80,000 into this thing and then realize I hate it.
Or how does it fit into my business and my work? That's why Tristan's story is so powerful, which is like there wasn't this pressure at the beginning to monetize this thing, to make it with like the future of his work. And that's what a lot of our audience does. And this was purely something that, and also Scott, through your own selfish persuasion of pushing him towards something that would be great for the book as well, and gave him that gift. It just started off as something that was energizing to him. So I think like one of the key things that I want to pause here on for a moment for our audience is like, does the idea of this project, to pursue it seriously, give you energy on some level? Even if it doesn't fit into some, like you can't see the grand plan, it will reveal itself, Scott, and correct us if we're wrong here, but it sounds like it will reveal itself if you dedicate the intensity to pursue this project seriously.
I will say this, because in Tristan's case, I don't think he was even thinking about changing careers. That wasn't the motivation for him doing this. If you were motivated from the idea of, I want to have work that I love, I think a good starting point is to pick a skill that is in the realm of people make money from this skill. So I use programming off as an example because it is one of the few skills that you can make a lot of money at and have a very successful professional career that requires no licensing and credentials, and you can go in it. But it isn't the only one. There's lots. Marketing, writing, there's lots of skills that if you got really, really good at them, you could be successful at it. Now, that being said, if you really like painting still lifes, maybe you can make a career out of it, but it's going to be a lot harder, even if you're excellent, just because people don't buy still lifes that much anymore. At the same time, I think that if you are thinking about, okay, I want this to be my profession, I want to go down a path to some sort of professional idea, you probably already have some ideas bumping around in the back of your head about like, I've always seen people talking about doing this and, I'd like to do that, but I don't know how. And so I've talked to a lot of people who they'll bring these up to me. I had a friend who he works for the Canadian Coast Guard right now, and he was saying how, he's always wanted to kind of do programming, but he just has kind of not been sure how to start. Or I was talking to another friend who was doing graphic design, and she was a bit fed up with where her career was going, but she was getting interested in like bookkeeping and accounting. It was like, I wouldn't actually mind having my own bookkeeping practice. And so these are little transitions, but they are things that if you have that in the back of your head, then saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to set up and design a project to get good enough at this skill that it will create a career for me is a good point. And the point I'm making about Tristan is that often when you do this, when you really learn the skill, you decide so you define a passion in yourself or a purpose in yourself that you didn't realize was there before. And the best example of this, I think, is even with James Clear just starting in the foreword of the book, he talks about how he kind of applied sort of unwittingly a lot of these principles in building his career. The funny thing is he talks about getting into writing, but, his real motivation was he wanted to be an entrepreneur. He wasn't really thinking of himself as a writer, so to speak. But now, of course, he's a best-selling author and like writing is what he does. And so I think very often as you acquire skills, you get good at something, it gives you that feedback that says, this is what I should make my life about. Even for me, I kind of got into writing sort of by happenstance about 13, 14 years ago. I started a blog because I wanted to get better at writing, but I didn't think I would be a writer. I thought writing would just be some sort of side activity that was supporting something else that I would do, with entrepreneurship and this kind of thing. And so I think that often building skills in this way, deciding to stake out a project, it often opens a lot of doors that you just hadn't even imagined before you started.
That's amazing, Scott. And in the book, you talk about these 9 principles of Ultralearning. You make it very clear that you're not talking about the 9 steps because it's not formulaic.
Yeah.
You make the analogy of think of these as 9 different dials that you can dial up or down based on the project that you choose to take on. But I do believe, at least in my opinion, my experience, that the first principle that you talk about tends to be the most important. And it's this concept of meta-learning, which most of us don't understand what the term means and don't do at the beginning of any project that we bring on. If you can stay with the example of Tristan, because I think it's really robust, and help us to define what does meta-learning mean? Why is it important? How did Tristan do it? How did you help Tristan do it at the beginning of his project?
Perfect. Yeah. So meta-learning, when you use the word meta or the prefix meta before words, it tends to mean things that are about themselves. So meta-learning is in some ways learning about learning. It's just a fancy way of saying that. And the idea behind meta-learning and the importance of it is that if you're going to take on your own project to get good at a skill, one of the challenges is that you don't know what you have to do. And so there's a bit of a catch-22 because you'll know what you have to do once you've done it, but you haven't done it, so you don't know what you have to do. So what do you do? And in this case, it's actually pretty easy to resolve. You just do a bit of research before you get started to figure out what's the way to do this. So if you wanted to learn programming, you start by Googling what's the best way to learn programming. I see this as trying to figure out a default path, trying to figure out what is the sort of normal way that people progress in this skill, but then also to try to identify resources, try to then identify what are going to be the bottlenecks, the obstacles, what are going to be the difficulties, so that you know about them in advance. So if you start learning a language, for instance, a really basic one is that you're going to have to learn a lot of words. And because you're going to have to learn a lot of words, then memory is going to be important. And so maybe investing in a system so that you can keep track of every word that you've learned and make sure that it sticks in memory is going to be more valuable than it would be for, let's say, like a physics class, or, if you're trying to learn to ski, that's not going to be as relevant. And so this kind of approach to learning things, of sort of trying to break down the project before you start, can be really valuable. Doesn't mean you're going to get everything right off the bat. You're going to have to adjust and experiment. But the thing that I found from the research, there's actually a really interesting set of literature on adult learning, or people who take on self-directed learning projects. And one of the things that is a finding in the literature is that people don't do this, that people just basically latch on to whatever sort of opportunity first comes up. So if your buddy knows about how to, fix this, you just ask them how to fix it. If you find the YouTube video, you go with that. And so I think this creates an opportunity for someone who is systematic and serious about it to identify advantages, because there's certainly skills where people don't do this and they really struggle. So my example is language learning. If you look at what are the most popular resources for learning languages and the ones that are the most popular amongst people who actually speak multiple languages, they're completely different. The fact that they're completely different, I think, is an evidence that if you do a bit of research, you'd find out, actually, most people don't really like Duolingo, but people who don't speak languages like Duolingo because it's fun. So that's sort of the example of where you can kind of spot those mismatches. So in Tristan's case, when he starts the project, some of the early things we were thinking about, one of the things we were thinking about is what are you going to do to get good at public speaking? And so obviously Toastmasters is a good place to start getting lots of practice. So he just started with that. We were at the beginning thinking that he was going to be gearing towards a TEDx talk. So that was sort of like their initial, if he can prepare to do a TEDx talk that's going to be published live, he'll have this record of it. That's a good kind of milestone to reach. So we were originally kind of formulating it in terms of that. A lot of TEDx talks, if you want to give one, if you are not already kind of well known, you usually have to make a submission. You have to say, okay, it'll be TEDx Baltimore or something. And you have to write in your submission of what your speech is going to be and why you're worth having on the TEDx stage and stuff. And so he was thinking, okay, I actually have to think ahead of time, because if I'm going to be trying to do this over 6 months or so, some of the application deadlines are going to be coming up pretty early. So I have to kind of apply for this TEDx talk before I've even learned a lot of what I have to do. And so this was sort of the beginning parts of this process that he's doing this work. But then stuff happens by happenstance. So it turns out in the first Toastmasters session he attended, he learned that in a week, they're actually having a competition. And that competition is the sort of first funnel competition for the World Championship. And so he gets in there and he says, actually, maybe in the short term, competing in this competition might help. It's just a club contest. There's just going to be, people in this local thing competing. I think he had to have 5 or 6 speeches done before he could compete in that. So he had to have 6 officially recognized Toastmaster speeches before he was allowed to compete. And this was happening in a week. So I guess I'm doing 6 speeches in 1 week. So he went around to different clubs and did his 6 speeches, racked it up, and he competed. And to his surprise, he won. And so that kind of encouraged him, okay, well then what's the next level? And then let's go on that. So I want to say that the meta learning, it happens kind of in 2 phases, so that there is a kind of preparatory phase. We were thinking originally TEDx, and we were thinking about Toastmasters, and it turns out the TEDx direction didn't really matter so much. He went in a different direction, but he still knew about it. That was still a plan. Like if he had lost one of the competitions early on, he probably still would have gone down that path as a kind of milestone achievement. But in the same time, the idea of Toastmasters as being, okay, this is going to be how I'm going to get my practice, was a really important sort of starting off point for him in that process. And so doing that initial preparation and decision-making was very important, even if he didn't go down exactly the path that he had intended initially.
Yeah, that's great, Scott. I mean, I think one of the things you say in the book is 10% of your time dedicated to an ultra learning project really needs to be this upfront part, right? This meta learning part, which is mapping out what does success look like? What would the steps be? I wrote this down after I finished reading your book, like 3 of the many ways that we suck at learning. This is like me. I think about number 1, we consume way too much information and we don't really ever put it into action. You think about people listening to podcasts all day long or reading tons of books. And let's think about Tristan as an example. I mean, if you wanted to get great at public speaking and you just started listening to audiobooks and listening to podcasts on speaking, but never really stepping on a stage, that doesn't necessarily fit in with this overarching mission of becoming a TEDx speaker. Number 2, I mean, I know you talk about this in the book as well. We tell ourselves, I'm not good at fill in the blank. I'm not good at drawing. I'm not good at learning. And that tends to be a thing that stops people from even going down this ultra learning path. And I know you cite Carol Dweck and mindset and how people with a fixed mindset feel that way. I'm not good at, even though those with a growth mindset, like you've proven in the book and she has in hers as well, that people who don't believe themselves to be good artists can learn how to draw with proficiency using this like mapping it out at the beginning of the project and then following your other principles. And this final one, I think this dovetails into the meta learning, which is we don't really learn how to most effectively learn about the skill or the subject that we're trying to take on. We just, like you said, dive in somewhere with a YouTube video and we don't actually figure out, like, do we talk to the people who have achieved expertise in those arenas and then figure out how they did it and then maybe model that for ourselves.
So with 2 of those points, I just want to kind of add on because I think you've really hit the nail on the head. And one of them I will say with preparation is that a big part of preparation in my mind is simply creating a project to do things. And this sounds again like, okay, yeah, all right, that sounds a little obvious, but almost nobody does this. People don't do projects. People just get an idea, a vague notion that they want to learn guitar or Spanish. And then they spend about 2 minutes, getting a book or an app. But there's no project, there's no plan, there's no, okay, I'm going to devote this many hours over this much time. Again, it doesn't have to be 80 hours a week. Even if you just said to yourself, I'm going to spend 10 minutes a day for 6 months, that would still be preferable to what we normally do, which is just, I'm going to learn whenever I feel like it. And I think if you take the ideas of this book seriously, that true learning when it is effective, is effortful, then this is going to work because it's always going to be easier to go on Facebook or Netflix or, surf Twitter. It's always going to be easier to just sit back and relax than actually do the work required for learning. So if you want to take on an ultra learning project, the best step is to make it a project, to say, okay, over the next 3 months, I want to get good at X. And maybe I don't have, 100 hours a week to devote to it, but I'm going to set aside a little bit of time. I'm going to put it in my calendar. I'm going to use these resources. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to avoid the kind of like the basic obvious obstacles. So for instance, we're talking about learning a language. One of the obstacles is I actually have to try to communicate with someone in this language as opposed to just doing grammar exercises in my book. This is obvious stuff, but at the same time, it often gets missed if we don't plan it in ahead of time. So that would be my first point. And then the second point, you were talking about not feeling good at something. And this is something that's really hard to convey because I do feel that there are differences in people's innate abilities in with particular subjects. Some people just have a little bit of an advantage. Some of that advantage is really masquerading as like prior knowledge. So if you have a lot of experience with a subject or related subjects already, that can sometimes create an enormous advantage over someone who has no experience. So my best example of that is when I went to Spain, I met all these Italians who were speaking Spanish, and they were just like I was, just started learning it as well. And their Spanish was way better than mine was. And I was like, oh man, it's these Europeans, they're just so good at learning languages. And it was only after learning Spanish that I realized Italian is so similar to Spanish that it is an enormous advantage. It's like Spanish and English are much further apart. And similarly, Chinese is even farther apart. So if you're slower learning Chinese, then it makes sense as well. So this is part of what adjusts and makes for all the differences that we observe between people learning things. But at the deep level, the way I feel about it is that learning is a kind of mechanical process. It's just a system. And so we often imbue it with all these emotions and all our baggage about being good or not good about this. And it has this kind of mysterious quality that like, oh, well, this person, they just have something called talent. And you don't know what talent is, but you can put it in quotes and it just imbues everything they do and allows them to be good at it. Whereas in practice, you're just doing things with your brain, with your nervous system, with your motor system. We all have the same kind of underlying principles for how our brains work and how they're organized. And so if you understand how that system works, it's mostly just about doing what is necessary to acquire those patterns to actually be able to perform it. I read a tweet the other day where someone was talking about being a guitar instructor and how many of his students complain, oh, well, you know what, my fingers just can't move that way. And he said, you know, people just totally underestimate how much their fingers can move that way if they just practice it enough. And I think that's true of so many things, that we think that it's innate abilities, but really the brain can modify itself. You can learn, you can adjust things. So if you want to be good at drawing, it actually involves just understanding what it takes to be good at drawing. And it turns out that there are some procedures and there's some concepts. And if you can practice them, you will be good at drawing. It's not really something magical or mysterious.
Scott, did you see anything? So to ask you the flip side question of that, did you see anything in your research and your studies that said actually there is some efficiencies to be gained through natural skills combined with aggressive learning and ultra learning? A lot of people ask me, they don't actually know what they're good at, and therefore they don't know what direction to go. And I'm curious what you saw there.
Well, so I think that obviously, again, I'll give an example. So Tristan's project, where he succeeded at this public speaking effort. Now, if he had been someone who was incredibly awkward to talk to in normal situations, I doubt he would have been as dramatically successful as he was, because obviously having some natural in-person charisma enables you to transfer that to the stage. And so similarly, if you are very funny in conversations, you will probably make a better stand-up comedian. So I don't think this is groundbreaking or earth-shattering for anyone. If you were always good at math in school, maybe you'll also be good at some math that you're also having to learn right now. This isn't to say that there's no impact of your prior strengths or talents. Indeed, it would be really weird if there wasn't any impact. But rather, I think the way that I'm looking at it is that the process of learning, what actually goes into learning, tends to be pretty universal. So it's not the case. A lot of people imagine it that it's the case that, well, you know, I'm a certain type of learner. This is something that gets bandied down a lot. I didn't talk about it in my book because it turns out that it isn't true. So the whole idea that, you know, there are visual learners or kinesthetic learners or auditory learners, which is super popular, turns out not to have any scientific evidence backing it, that of all the different types of learning styles that they've looked at, it doesn't turn out that presenting information in someone's preferred modality really works. And so this is, I think, kind of evidence of the universality of learning, that if you want to learn something, I don't want to say it's exactly the same for all people, but the mechanisms tend to be quite similar, that what has to happen in your brain tends to be quite similar. And so the idea here about the learning styles is that we kind of intuitively feel like it might be true because people do have different abilities. Some people are better with spatial stuff. Some people are better with visual stuff. Some people are better with listening or these kinds of modalities. But being better at it doesn't mean that, okay, if we're learning geography and I listen to it on an audiobook versus, you know, reading it, that's going to improve my learning because it matches my modality. It just turns out isn't the case. And so I think that when we're approaching learning, the right way to think about it is that there is a process for learning. And if we align our learning with these basic principles, we'll be more effective because we're trying to really do what has to happen in the brain in order to create skill.
Now, when people think about ultra learning or learning a technical skill or doing a project, maybe people would think about some of the examples that you've given, right? Like computer programming or becoming an expert speaker or learning the piano or an instrument. But one thing that I see, particularly with the clients that I work with, is that they need to learn work-life balance. They need to learn self-care. They need to learn mental health. And I'd be really curious if you were going to be a coach right now, Scott. Like say I came to you and I said, I need to ultra learn how to prioritize the most important things in my life, like health, my mental well-being. I'm chronically busy. I have no space or time to take care of my own needs. Then how would you coach me using your principles around how to become expert at that in a short period of time?
I think what you're talking about, so if we're talking about, let's use the work-life balance as an example, that, you know, I'm too busy, my life's a mess, I'm stressed out all the time. This is a situation where it is a kind of learning project, but it's not necessarily going to look like, you know, learning a language in a short period of time, especially because, you know, diving deep into doing something 80 hours a week is probably the opposite of getting a work-life balance if that was what you were trying to achieve in that moment. And so I think the right way to think about it is that a lot of the principles that I talk about in the book are really principles of how the brain works. So one of those obviously is the idea of directness. So that's one of the principles that I talk about in the book. And it turns out that this idea of basically that when you learn something, it tends to be quite context specific, is actually quite general and applies to things that you wouldn't even really think about naively as being related to learning. So just a kind of side example, I recently read this book, Anxious, by Joseph Ledoux, an NYU neuroscientist, and he was talking about the neuroscience of anxiety. And one of the things he's talking about in the book is how when you learn not to be afraid, if you have some kind of fear that's built up, either phobia, maybe public speaking fear, something like this, they can guide you through a protocol of exposure in order to reduce that fear. But the problem is that the exposure protocol, it tends to produce quite specific memories that you learn to feel safe in quite a particular situation. So if you have social anxiety, maybe you only feel safe when your friend is with you. And once your friend's not with you, you start panicking, or you only feel safe because, this kind of thing is happening and you feel safe in that very narrow situation. And so the interesting thing was here is that this is not really a learning thing in terms of how people typically think about learning. I mean, being less anxious, it feels not really a learning kind of project or goal. It's a sort of at a basic psychology level. Yet this principle of directness, this principle of the kind of the transfer, the sort of context specificity of the things that you are acquiring in your brain is pretty universal. And so that to me indicates that the kind of the principle at work, the reason why directness is important, the reason why you have to learn things in this way in your studies is because this general principle of how the brain works is that it does things in quite specific ways, so that if you learn it in this narrow context, it may not activate in a somewhat different context. And so if you want to activate in lots of different contexts, you have to try it in lots of different contexts. And so if we're going to apply this to, let's say, work-life balance, take this principle of directness, that would be one of the things I would look about. As I would look at, okay, what is my routine? What are the things that I'm doing? What are the habits I want to install? And then as you start installing those habits and you start looking at the cues and things that trigger them, you start building those habits. At the beginning, maybe you want to just get this person to have a routine that works. So you give them a productivity system that they can use. You get them to, let's say, schedule their free time off on their calendar. You get them to work on these things. But then you also have to look at how different things so that the context shifts slightly and they fall back on their old habits. So they move to a new job, or, they have a new baby come, or something else disrupts their environment. And all those things they learn, they no longer apply because they only worked in this very narrow situation. So this is an area where I think if you really understand these principles, they actually are quite broad and they apply to lots of different things because they signal something about how our brain works at a kind of fundamental level. And I think if you can really understand that you can apply that to a lot more than even just things that look like learning projects.
I hear you talking. I'm thinking about all these different examples of this concept of directness, which is the third principle you have in the book, is really about putting this stuff into action. It's the difference between, again, like listening to a podcast on speaking and then actually being on a stage and speaking.
It sounds like the difference between consuming and creating. Yeah.
Right. Like we're downloading an app to learn a language versus doing what Scott did and going to the country and actually immersing yourself. There's going to be more hiccups, more bumps. It's more uncomfortable in the short term, but radically enhances your growth. So as we're talking about putting yourself, your life into balance, the example you gave, which was routines, this is something that Bryan and I talk a lot about, which is people who say they don't have enough time for themselves typically have a chaotic, unintentional morning routine, a chaotic, unintentional evening routine. They just kind of flop into bed, watch TV until they pass out, wake up in the morning, kids screaming, and then in their cell phones until it's time to race out the door, and then rinse and repeat over the course of the life. Mm-hmm. So if what I'm hearing you say, Scott, is if you can actually start to look at these things around lifestyle design is really like this big category of where you could ultra learn, and then to break it into these categories of, okay, let me learn a routine that works in multiple contexts, not just one narrow one, and then refine my understanding and awareness of how to create this repeatably, then I can absolutely ultra learn lifestyle design.
I think that what you're talking about also reminds me, you made a point about process design. And I think this is very often the case that a lot of the skills that we want to learn are not about achieving an outcome once, but about achieving it reliably and repeatedly. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is my own writing routine, that I'm trying to write an article once a week. And so it's not so much that I'm trying to write that one perfect article, but how do I regularly generate better writing? How do I generate better ideas? How do I generate more engaging content? And so that's an example of learning a skill where you're not just trying to learn how to do something once, you're learning how to create processes that can basically design this kind of, like, you can imagine like an assembly line in a factory. You're trying to create processes so that it won't have bottlenecks. It won't have places where, oh, there's a breakdown at, section 2 or this kind of thing. And so I think when we're thinking about our lives, it's very often a similar approach, that when we're looking at, okay, I want to live a more calm, less stressful, more productive, happier, kind of serene existence. Well, it's easy to talk about this at sort of at a very broad scale, like, okay, maybe I should give up Facebook, or maybe I should, not do this or do that. But I think if you look at it as your life as being consisting of all these little processes, so there's the, all the things you have to do at home, there's all the things you have to do at work, there's all the relationships you want to maintain, exercise, all these kinds of things, and then how they all fit together smoothly, you can start to notice, oh, the problem is that I think that I'm going to exercise, but then 8 p.m. rolls around and I'm too exhausted and I never do it. And so if you can notice these little things, you can make these little adjustments as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, we got about 5 or so minutes left, Scott, and I know we hit all 9 of the principles, which we knew we weren't going to. But if you were to look through that list and, based on the context of the conversation we've been having today, what is another principle that you would absolutely want people to know about, that you've written about regarding the ultralearning process?
Well, I think they're all pretty important. So I feel like it's hard for me to pick and choose, because I think that they all have a really big impact. One principle that I like to bring up, because I think not so much that, oh, everyone loves this principle, but just because I think it's really neat and it has this sort of deeper implication towards how we learn things and how we process information, is just this idea of retrieval. And retrieval is the idea that if you want to be able to remember something, you have to practice remembering it, not just reviewing it. And so there's a lot of studies that I cover in the book that show that people are often mistaken as to how well they know something. And so the classic example, I think, is how many books have you read that you can barely remember the contents of the book? And I think this is another example of where, if you can understand this principle really deeply, it doesn't just come up in studying or reading books. It comes up in all sorts of situations. I was talking to someone who was preparing for a speech, and they were just looking at their cue cards over and over again, reading them in order to prepare for the speech. And if you understand this principle of retrieval, you understand why that's a terrible way to memorize a speech. You actually have to cover it up and actually try to give your speech without looking at the notes, even if it's going to go terribly the first time. And so I think the other thing about retrieval is that it just sort of, in my mind, highlights this idea of ultralearning. It's kind of an analogy for the overall practice of ultralearning, that retrieval is harder than just doing review. So most people don't do it by default. It works a lot better than review does, but people aren't aware of that. And often they have the intuition of the opposite, that the thing that they think is at making them better is actually not very helpful. And so I think this overall approach to learning things requires some deliberateness. It requires some understanding of how learning really works. But then once you understand that, once you really grok that picture, it's a lot easier to say to yourself, okay, if I really wanted to get good at this, how would I do it? And so applying all of these principles, all the ideas that we've talked about in this episode here, I think that there's a lot of skills that someone could approach that maybe they haven't been successful in the past, or maybe they haven't made as much progress as they would like, and they could approach it again with a new, fresh take.
Your concept of retrieval really hit home for me, and I actually practiced it when learning your 9 principles. So I remember, I wrote them down. That's a part of my process. But then it was like I was taking a walk through the park, and I'm like, how many of these 9 principles can I remember? I'm going to try this right now. I'm going to try to do the 9 principles. So I'm going to close my eyes. Okay, so we have Metalearning, we have focus, we have directness, drilling, retrieval. This may not be in the right order, but I know that we have retention, we have feedback, intuition, and experimentation.
Wow, you got them all.
And your eyes were closed. I can confirm it. That was legit.
Yeah, he was genuinely remembering. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like it really hit home for me. I was like, I write a lot of things down, but then later on, I don't necessarily know what I wrote down. So for me, the trigger that I had to set for myself was, okay, when I'm away from this material, how much of these can I retain? And the first time I did it, I maybe remembered 4 or 5, not necessarily in order. And then I did it again, and then boom, like they're pretty well ingrained in there. So this principle really.
You know what I would leave people with, if we're kind of wrapping up the discussion, I would leave people with the idea of how much more effective would you be if all the ideas that you heard and read about actually made an impact in your life? And I think this is what this skill is about. So if you can think about it in that terms, that you can think about it in terms of, okay, what if I actually, all the books that I read, all the ideas that are sort of in the queue of, well, this would be nice. What if they actually made an impact in my life? They made an impact in my thinking. What kind of person would I be? And I think if you can really follow that to its logical conclusion, you can see why I'm so eager and excited about this book.
Scott, I've got a whiteboard in my room that's 6 foot by 4 feet. And it usually has scribblings all over it of different musings.
Mm-hmm.
And so your last bit of information here has really influenced me to say, hey, go turn that into an impact sort of thing. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, Scott, this has been an awesome conversation. It's been really specific for our audience, and I really appreciate that about you. So your book is Ultralearning, Accelerate Your Career, Master Hard Skills, and Outsmart the Competition. You absolutely have to go out and buy that right now on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. And Scott, is there anything else that you want to direct our audience towards, whether it's your blog or something else that you have out there that we can stay connected to you with?
Sure. Well, I recommend checking out my blog. It's scotthyoung.com. That's SCOTTHYOUNG.com. I have over 1,000 articles there about habits, learning, goal setting, personal development, many of the topics that I know you talk about on your podcast. I also have a podcast where I narrate a lot of my content and ideas. So if you prefer to listen, you can listen to that as well.
Awesome.
Great.
We will link those in the show notes. Scott, thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. And also thank you for what you're putting out there in the world, man. This is going to make a big difference for a lot of people who need some direction right now.
Thanks.
How would you like to hang out with Bryan and I live and in living color? Well, if so, join us on Thursday, November 14th here in New York City for a discussion about modern manhood. Conversations about the complicated world of being a good man today. Now, Modern Manhood is the name of a brand new book written by Emmy-nominated journalist Cleo Stiller, who's also a friend of ours, who is going to be our special guest in helping us to unpack all of these gray areas of what it means to be a good man today, particularly focused on the arena of sexuality, intimacy, and courting women, which is where a lot of things can go wrong in today's era if we're not consciously having these conversations. So it's Thursday, November 14th from 7 to 9 p.m. at the Assemblage NoMad. There will be a link in the show notes, and you can also go to our website, doinnerwork.com, and you can click on the Discerning Dick tab, which is our live event series. It's our 11th live event. And this time we're hosting Cleo Stiller to have the conversation about modern manhood. Doinnerwork.com and go to the Discerning Dick tab to buy your tickets. See you there.